Adding and subtracting unlike fractions will be our last topic of this chapter. Unlike fractions. So unlike fractions are fractions with different denominators. So if you look at the example, they have 2/3 and 1/4. If you look at them, they have different denominators. Okay, their whole thing is made up of different size pieces. This one needs 3 to make one whole. This one needs 4 to make one whole. So they have different denominators, so they are unlike fractions. The most important thing with unlike fractions is that when you add or subtract them together, they have to have a common denominator. So you have to find the least common denominator because it will help you simplify at the end. So the least common denominator, or you might notice as LCD, is the smallest of all possible common denominators. In order to find your least common denominator, you need to find the multiples of your denominators. So if I have 1/3, I need to list all the multiples of 3. So the multiples of 3 are 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, and so forth. All the numbers that when you multiply 3 by another number, it makes these as its answer. List the multiples of 6. You have 6, 12, 18, and 24. After you listed a few, then you need to find the smallest number that is the same. Okay, so in our multiples, 6 and 6 are the smallest ones. Now you may look, they also had 12 and 18 as common factors or common multiples, but you want to use the smallest one. So your least common denominator would then be 6. So you need to find the multiples and the smallest multiple in order to make a common denominator. The steps to adding and subtracting unlike fractions. You need to have a common denominator. That is a must. You cannot add or subtract things when they are not made up of the same amount of whole things. Okay, one might need 3 things that make up the whole. One might have 4 things that make up the whole. You cannot add and subtract them together if they're not made up of the same size pieces. So, the first step. If it's a mixed number, convert to an improper fraction using MAD. Again, this step is not always necessary. Remember MAD from our multiplying and dividing topics? That's just how you convert a mixed to an improper. Once you have your fractions ready, you need to find the least common denominator of both fractions. You then need to rewrite the problem, so multiply both the top and the bottom by the number that creates your least common denominator. Once you have a common denominator, you can then go ahead and add and subtract these fractions once alike. And then our 5th step is you're going to simplify if needed. You're not always going to need to simplify. Most of the time, if you find the correct least common denominator, you might not have to simplify. Then 6 is not always necessary either. Make into a mixed number if needed. Remember, we cannot have improper fractions. So those are the steps that we need to do in order to add and subtract unlike fractions. Remember, you always need a common denominator. Let's take a look at some examples. So number 1, I have 3/5 and I'm adding 1/3. Right away you should look at these and know that there is not a common denominator. They are unlike fractions. So you need to make up a common denominator by finding the least common multiples of both of these numbers. So to the side, I would put a 5. And what are the multiples of 5? 5 times 1 is 5. 5 times 2 is 10. 5 times 3 is 15. 5 times 4 is 20. Then what are your multiples of 3? 3 times 1 is 3, 3 times 2 is 6, 3 times 3 is 9, 3 times 4 is 12, and 3 times 5 is 15. Oops, I can stop once I find a number in common. So the smallest number they have in common would be 15. So I need to rewrite these fractions to have a common denominator. Okay, how do I get from 5 to 15? I have to multiply it by 3. Whatever you do to the bottom, you do to the top. Okay, this gives me a 9 out of 15. This one has 3. How do I get to 15? I have to multiply it by 5. If I multiply 5 on the bottom, you have to do it to the top. So now I have two fractions. I have 9 over 15 and I have 5 over 15. So I can add these together because they now have a common denominator. So 9 plus 5 gives us a 14 out of 15. And you cannot simplify that down. They have nothing in common. Our next example, when we're subtracting, again, you should notice that there is no common denominator. So you need to find the list of the multiples that 4 and 8 make. 4 times 1 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8, 4 times 3 is 12, 4 times 4 is 16. I'm going to stop right there. 8 times 1 is 8, 8 times 2 is 16. I'm going to stop right there. They have an 8 and a 16 in common. But remember, you want to use the least common multiple, which is 8. So I need to rewrite these fractions so that there's an 8 in the denominator. If you notice, our first fraction is already an 8. So I do not need to do anything with this. Okay, my second fraction was 3/4. Okay, I need to multiply by 2 to both the top and bottom to get to 8. Okay, I have 3 over 8, and now I can subtract it by 6 over 8 because they have a common denominator of 8. 3 minus 6 gives us a -3 out of 8. So again, remember, when you're adding them once they're alike, you keep your denominator. So those are some examples. We'll be doing a bunch more examples in class tomorrow.